Well, happy Father's Day, everyone. It's so good to sort of see you through the other side of the lens here. It's my privilege today to introduce our special guest speaker, Mr. Paul Racine. Paul is a good friend and a mentor of mine, as well as a friend and a mentor to many of the pastors in the Ottawa area. He's been serving with Doulos Ministries since 2001, and he's one of the people responsible for planning and running of the No Other Name Youth Rally that takes place on Good Friday every Easter. He's very involved with the Cree community up north, where we've had the privilege of taking our teams of students and leaders for the past 2 years. Paul is a super dedicated football coach, and the reason why he looks so tired and sad all the time is because he's also an avid supporter of the Buffalo Bills. So you can pray for him if you'd like. All that to say, I always look forward to hearing Paul speak. He's such a great communicator and such a wonderful storyteller as well. So all of that to say, I hope you'll join me in virtually welcoming our special guest, Paul Racine.
Well, thank you, Matt, for that very kind introduction, and also for your acknowledgement of the Buffalo Bills as a football team. And there are people like myself who are indeed huge football fans, and that's because we are the eternal optimists, that one day they will indeed accomplish what has not yet been done. And I make no apologies for being a Bills fan. Somebody has to cheer for them, and I'm glad to be part of that number. But my other claim to fame as well is that I knew your senior pastor, Mike Lennon, back when he was a youth pastor working out of Eastgate Alliance. And Mike and I had teamed up quite a number of times to be able to do things together back in the day. And it's thrilling for me now to be able to see him here serving along with you. And I deeply appreciate as well the fact that you have allowed me the opportunity not only to be able to partner with Matt, but also with other people from your church who have come up in the last 2 summers and helped us out with our camps that we've been doing up in the Cree community. That has been wonderful, not only in terms of an experience, but also as an incredible opportunity to get to know your people better and to be able to help them catch a vision for what God is doing amongst our First Nation communities, and to be able to come alongside and serve our brothers and sisters in Christ up there. This morning, I'm going to be speaking from the passage in Luke 15, which you've had read to you already. And I want us to be able to set the background a little bit more for this so that you can appreciate the context and what Jesus is going to be talking about here with something that we have in my Bible here. It's subtitled The Parable of the Lost Son. Most of us are probably somewhat familiar with it as a story of the prodigal son. And it is indeed a story of a prodigal, and we're going to look at that. But I want us at first to be able to stop and look at the context. And the reason is because anytime you see this in your Bibles, when you're reading it in Luke chapter 15, verse 11, it says, Jesus continued. So in other words, what he's about to share with you is a continuation of a thought that he's already been putting forward. And it's important for us to be able to understand the context of this thought in order to be able to more deeply appreciate what the message is that Jesus is truly communicating here. Previous to this, he had been talking with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious leaders, as well as his disciples. And you find out at the beginning of chapter 15 that Jesus has been eating with a group of people. And basically, they're a collection of what the religious leaders are calling sinners. They're saying, hey, this guy meets with tax collectors and sinners, and he eats with them. I mean, he engages with them on a personal, intimate level. And for the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they would have seen this almost as us not social distancing amongst COVID-19, in the fact that there are things that these people bring into your home, into your meal, into the situation, and they pass that on to you in terms of the sin that they've been involved in. And it leaves you as being unclean. And how could you, as a religious leader, Jesus, as somebody who's supposedly calls himself the Messiah, how could you not see this in terms of what you're doing to yourself? Amazing thing about it, though, is that in the continuation where Jesus moves into the story of the prodigal, Jesus wants them to be able to capture something here. The first story that he shares with them is the whole issue here of the fact of the lost sheep and how Jesus goes out and pursues this one sheep in order to be able to find it where it is and then carries it home. The second story is about the woman who had 10 silver coins and she lost one, each silver coin basically representing the idea of a day's wage. And all of a sudden she's lost one. And she goes frantically searching throughout her house until she finds it. And then she rejoices. What's amazing about it is that in both these situations, when it comes to encountering and finding the lost, Jesus says, and there is rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents. And this is important because the people who were listening to this, especially the religious leaders, would have looked at it and said, well, that makes sense. We understand sheep. I mean, sheep are a big part of our culture, and sheep can get lost. Sheep can make poor decisions. Sheep can end up doing things and all of a sudden find themselves in a situation they can't get out of, and a good shepherd would go after that sheep. Oh, and there's no question. If you lost a silver coin, a whole day's wage, you would do anything you could to try and find that coin, and that you definitely would pursue it. What they were missing, and this is why Jesus continues with the story about the prodigal, is that he was trying to get them to be able to understand something, and that is this: the extravagance of grace. God's grace, motivated by his pure love for all of us. And we are used to, in our society, as much as they were used to them, and that is that there is a reward for behavior as a measuring rod. And so some of us might be familiar with the term good for nothing. And it's not used as an affirmation type of statement. It's often used as something that's a derogatory thing. You're just good for nothing. There's nothing you can do that's good. But it also is an implication and an inference in the way that we look at reward for behavior, for effort, for things that we put out in order to be able to accomplish something. And that is that, well, why would somebody be good if there's no return? And so if you're going to be good and of value, there's got to be a sense of return for that. We're going to see this reflected in the life of the older brother towards the end of this story. But what Jesus wants us to appreciate here right now is this, and that is that you expect a positive return for effort, for labor, for time that you give something. The amazing thing about God, though, is that he looks at us and he says to us, it doesn't matter what labor, what time, what effort you put into this, it's all about what I do for you. And Jesus understood that. He understood the price he was going to pay by his life being given up on the cross, by his blood being shed for the forgiveness of sin. He understood that that would be the only way you and I could ever come to understand and know the most important thing that he wanted us to know, and that is a relationship with God. Not just with God, but with God as Father. And not just as Father, but Jesus used the intimate term Abba, a child's cry. A child's term for their dad, Abba. This was something that blew the people of the day away. They understood God as someone who was up there and to be feared and reverenced and the whole bit. And you're saying to us that this God wants us to approach him with the same intimacy that a child would approach a loving father? This was something that was pretty staggering for them. Now comes the story. Here you find out that the man has two sons, an older son and a younger son, and the younger son comes up to his dad one day, and paraphrasing it for you, he basically looks at his dad and says, I wish you were dead. I wish right now you were dead. I wish I didn't have to wait for it to happen. I just want you to know, I wish right now you were dead. Now the religious leaders would be looking at that type of thing and see it as a total affront. I mean, much as we would today too, that would be a disrespectful thing for any son to be able to say to their dad. Back then, it was something that was seen as being just horrendous. How could a child, a son, ever speak to their father in that way? And what's amazing about it is that the son is saying to his dad, I wish you were dead, and then I wish that what I had coming to me in the inheritance, I could get now. So I could just do whatever I want with it, however I want to do it, and by the way, without your control, without you peering over my shoulder, and without me having to feel that I had to be accountable to you in any way, shape, or form. I just want what's coming to me now and the freedom to do with it what I want to do with it. And by the way, I don't want to be working in your fields anymore. I don't want to be listening to your orders and your commands and the things you want me to do in obedience. I just want to do what I want to do. The amazing thing about it is the father in silence goes ahead and basically gives in to the son. It says that it took the son some time in order to be able to deal with the affairs. In other words, what he's doing is he's liquidating things. He's selling it into cash because that's all he wants to take with him. He's not holding on to this as a long-term investment. In his recklessness, all he wants is the money so he can go off and do what he wants. And it says he moved to a far-off country. And there it tells us that he squandered his wealth in wild living. As a matter of fact, the older brother later says, Dad, he spent your money on prostitutes. And basically that was a cultural reference which they would have understood at the time. And that is that most of the prostitution that existed in that day was tied very, very, very clearly and linked with the spiritual practices of worship of false gods. And so the oldest son's looking and saying, you know what the younger brother did, don't you? You know what your younger son did. I mean, he didn't just squander your money, Dad. He did it in such a way that it was a total affront to you. And that it was even in the action of doing things for false gods. There probably was nothing more that you could put as something that was a negative attack on somebody than that type of a claim. The younger son went ahead, though, squandered his wealth in wild living. And isn't it fascinating to be able to see God's timing on things sometimes? What does God do? It says that all of a sudden within the land came a severe famine. This famine is so severe that not only is this son suddenly left without money, but it says in verse 16 that no one gave him anything. Now I want you to be able to appreciate the emptiness of the moment for the younger son here. What it's telling us here is that he hasn't got a single relationship in his life right now which can bring him any sense of healing, any sense of purpose, any sense of hope, any sense of light in his darkness, and nobody cares for him right now. Whatever friends he may have had beforehand, they're not there for him now. Not when he's penniless, and not when he's destitute, and not when he's starving. In verse 17 is a beautiful thing. And matter of fact, if you're going to highlight anything in your Bible, I would encourage you to highlight this first part of verse 17. And it says, in terms of the son, when he came to his senses. For those of you who have children that you are concerned about and that you're praying for, I want you to be able to understand something. This passage especially is there for you to be able to understand something. God knows the heartbreak of what it means to have children who are not walking in the way that you would hope that they would walk, and especially not in relationship with God. And what should you be praying for them? Pray, Luke 15:17. Lord, bring them to their senses. Lord, do the work that only you can do in their life that will bring them to their senses. He says, I'm starving to death. I am literally starving to death. He has a job right now that was given to him, and I imagine it was given to him almost in mockery by the people of the land, by the fellow that he'd hired himself out to. And it says the fellow hired him in order to be able to go off into his land and feed his pigs. And the crazy thing about it is it says that this young boy, and he wouldn't have been a young boy, he would have been a young man at this time, he looked at the food that the pigs were eating and wished that he could even eat it, but he was denied even that. I mean, how much lower for a good Jewish young man could you fall than to realize to yourself that you are actively involved in hurting and taking care of something that leaves you unclean? And by the way, you are so low right now in life, you're not even worthy of eating the food that the pigs eat. And the young man realizes to himself, I'm hungry, I'm starving to death. But by the way, you need to remember something here. This wasn't just a physical thing. This was this young boy, young man now realizing something, and that is that he was starving to death in every area of his life. His soul was shriveling up. All the things that at one time brought him pleasure, now all of a sudden were no longer there. And by the way, the pleasure that he had never, ever, ever brought him fulfillment. Suddenly, it says in verse 18, the young man says, I will go back to my father. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to my dad. Amazing thing about it here is that when I have come to this portion in the passage over and over and over again, I have always stopped and asked myself this question. Where did that thought come from? I mean, like seriously, the last time you were with your dad, what you said to him was this, I wish you were dead. And now all of a sudden, you've got the thought in the fact that you become completely destitute. You've got this thought inside of yourself that says, I'm going back to dad. I'm going back to my father. The religious leaders at the time who were listening to this would have been thinking exactly the same thing. Where in the world does this kid get off thinking he can now come home? And more importantly, that the dad would have anything to do with him. But you know why the son realizes this? Because there was one thing he was unable to shake the whole time, even in his experiences. The positive pleasures of sin, and then the negative outcome and consequences of the lifestyle that he'd chosen. And the amazing thing about it, there was one thing that always stood there as a truth that he could never shake. And that is that his father was good. His father was good. And he reflects this by saying, even the servants in my father's household have all the food they want. They're well taken care of. My dad knows how to care for people. At the very least, I'll ask him to take me back as a servant. Can you imagine? He starts off for home. And by the way, the very fact that it tells us that he was living in a distant country means this isn't a trip that's simply going to take days. This young man is walking. This is a trip that probably stretched into weeks as he begins to move himself towards home. And even on his way home, because he has no money, he has no provision, he's only getting more and more emancipated. He's only looking weaker and more hungry and dirtier. As he starts off this journey home, I'm sure it started off with some great resolve. I'm going home. I'll try and just appeal to my dad's goodness, and I'll try and work that out. Can you imagine as the journey stretches then from weeks into the last few days of the journey, and as this boy begins to move and move closer and closer to home, what that begins to look like for him? Imagine the last day when he knows now he's within walking distance. Today, he'll make it home. He'll make it home this day. What's going through his head? You and I and everyone else, we all have in our heads this narrator. And the narrator is that voice that oftentimes is trying to describe what it thinks the story is for us. And oftentimes, too, is looking ahead and pretty much in a negative way. And narrating to us, well, you know what's going to happen to you when you get home, don't you? You know your dad's not going to accept you. You know he's going to be upset. You know the first thing he's going to look at you and go, well, look at you. Look at what you look like now. Are you happy about this situation? Look where you find yourself. I mean, isn't this the consequence of all the bad decisions you made? Well, my goodness in that. Look at you, you're just a wreck. And what are you coming home for now? I gave you everything that was coming to you. That's what the narrator in this boy's head is going on and saying. Because the narrator often lends itself only towards the negative. And as we listen to that voice, it can weigh on us heavily and shape our perspective on what we think is going to be coming up in the next moment. As this boy gets closer and closer to home, I want you to be able to appreciate something. And that is this. His steps must become more and more laborious because that voice is just now screaming in his head. And as he comes close and he starts seeing more and more familiar surroundings that he grew up with, maybe passing by some of the fields that he had worked in at one time, or maybe avoided working in because of his rebellion. But as he starts passing all these landmarks that trigger all these past memories, all of a sudden he's feeling it within himself, a heaviness as he's taking every step. And you can almost feel that his shoulders would be hunching more, his back would just be like it was carrying a burden, his face would be down, looking at the ground, and just willing himself to take each step. But each step that he takes says, turn around now. You don't want to honestly experience what you're going to experience right now because it's going to be so negative. It's going to be such a dismissal. Believe me, you think you're in pain now? Wait till you see Dad's rejection. And wait till you see his anger. Wait till you see the judgment that he's going to look at you and say, you deserve what you've got. You deserve the state you're in. And every step this boy takes, that's all he's hearing inside of his head. And every step he keeps saying to himself, take the next step by turning around. Don't be going forward. Go back. This is not something you want to be able to walk into right now. The amazing thing it is that I love about this, it says in verse 20, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled for compassion for him, and he ran to his son. Isn't that beautiful? This father, matter of fact, the way it's written here in the Greek, and that it implies this, that while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. In other words, there was a habitual part of the father, a habit that he had formed, where he would look each day down that road that his son had walked away on, hoping that his son would return. And each day he would look and wonder, this day, would his son come back? And this day he looks out and he sees this figure coming towards him. I mean, this doesn't look anything like his son. I mean, this kid is broken. This young man is no longer somebody who's walking around haughty and filled with pride and self-confidence and no longer looking like a wealthy individual. As a matter of fact, this kid's dressed in rags. This kid's dirty. This kid's skinny. This kid looks starving. As a matter of fact, the more he comes closer to home, the father's realizing something. That hunch in his shoulders, the way his shoulders and his back just keep dropping forward, the way he can't even lift his face off the ground. But the father recognizes something. That's my son. That's my son. And it says that he is filled with compassion. The beautiful thing here about this whole aspect of compassion is that it means a willingness now to suddenly enter into somebody else's suffering, into their story, and encounter everything about it with a passion that says, you care. And that's exactly what the Father does here. As a matter of fact, it's beautiful about it because he breaks all the rules. Once again, it says he's filled with compassion for his son instead of judgment. The religious leaders would have looked at him and said, oh, you've got to be kidding. This kid deserves your wrath. It says he's filled with compassion. And then it says he ran to his son. Matter of fact, if you were wealthy back in those days, you never ran. If you needed to run to do something, you would have looked and said to one of your servants, looks like my son, go fetch him. Go get him. Go now. Run. And they would go off and they would do it. But this father chooses to run himself. Why? Because he can't wait to get there. And not only that, but because he realizes that the narrator in this kid's head is saying to him, turn around. You don't want this moment. You don't want to experience what's about to happen. You really want to be going in the opposite direction. And dad doesn't want to leave the kid a choice. And he runs towards him. And then I love what it does. Filled with compassion for him, he ran to his son. And then it says he threw his arms around him and he kissed him. He held on to him and he kissed him. What he's basically saying to his son, without a single word here, by the way, the father still remains silent. Without a single word, the father puts all of his love into action. And he's holding on to his son because he knows within his son right now is probably everything in the world that says, I don't deserve to be here. I know what I said to you. I know how much it hurt you. I could see it in your eyes when I said it. And even though you never said a word, Dad, I know it was painful. But you still let me do what I wanted to do and let me go. Dad, I don't deserve to be here right now with everything that I've done. And the father knows that. And he's holding on to his son to let him know something. You're not going back. You're not going back. You're home. You're here now. Isn't it beautiful, this action of love on the part of the Father towards someone who doesn't deserve this unbelievable, extravagant grace? But God demonstrated his own love towards you and me in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That's the grace. That's the love that is behind that for each one of us. What's beautiful here then is the Father even goes on and that he's wrapped in the arms of his father. His father is kissing him, and the son's trying to get the words out. Dad, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And the father's response is not, no, you're absolutely right. I just want you to be able to know something. You're right. You don't deserve to be called my son. As a matter of fact, I have every right to want to judge you right now and be ashamed of you. Instead, what the father is doing here is demonstrating the love, and then he makes these incredible words. Turns to his servants, who would probably run after the whole situation, wondering what's going on here. And they're just looking in shock at what's taking place between the father and his prodigal son. Beautiful thing about it is then all of a sudden he says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Change him out of his rags. Put him back into the position that he was in. And I want you to put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet and prepare the fattened calf. We're going to have a party. Most beautiful thing in here is that the robe and the sandals were basically a symbol for this boy that you want to know something? You're no longer poor. You're no longer destitute. I'm welcoming you back in the position you had before you left. The ring that he places upon his finger, the ring was probably the most important gift of all, because basically it was a credit card to everything the father had. because with that ring, it symbolized not only the son's position once again within the family, but anything that son desired. Anytime he went shopping, anytime he wanted anything, all he had to do was show the ring. And anybody who was in business and selling something to him would know right away the debt will be covered because the father guarantees it with the ring that the son wears. Now, how's that for somebody who went ahead and said, give me everything coming to me, and then he squanders it and blows it off and then comes home with nothing. And dad says, hey, here's the ring. Here's the credit card to everything. I promise you, you will lack nothing. And then the father makes those beautiful words. We need to celebrate. We need to celebrate. We need to have a party. Beautiful thing about it here with that is that again is a reflection of the first two things that Jesus shared with us. And that is that there is much rejoicing in heaven when a single sinner repents. For you and me, though, that type of extravagant grace can be something that might be even more hard to fathom. You know, we can look at it in a story like this and say, I can accept that. I can appreciate it. Man, that's beautiful. But is it beautiful to us when it honestly is extended to everybody around us? Or is there a part of us, and this is something that I've had to ask myself every time I read this passage, every time I reflect upon it, and that is that, Paul, is there a part of you, though, that's like the older brother? See, the older brother comes home, and first thing he hears here is a party going on inside the house. And he's wondering, what is happening? And all of a sudden, he not only hears the party that's going on, but all of a sudden he finds out that the party is happening because the younger brother has come home. And dad is celebrating. This older brother is so ticked. I mean, he is honestly just ripped to the core. And right now he's ripped to the core because he's angry. He is so unbelievably filled with wrath. He would have been much happier to have come home that day from being obedient and doing the work in the fields that his father needed done, and come home that day with the message waiting for him that, by the way, your younger brother is dead. He's dead. That wild living caught up to him. He's dead. Older brother probably would have just sat there and done the right religious thing, have looked and said, oh, that's too bad. I'm so sorry for the choices he made. But inside he'd be thinking, yeah, but he got what was coming to him. He got the result and the consequences and the fruit of all of that. So you want to know something? Well deserved. Well deserved. He is so ticked, he won't even go inside the house. He is so angry at what's taking place. The father here, once again, demonstrates extravagant grace. His older son is so angry with the situation, he won't even come into the house. And what's beautiful about the father here is he goes out to the older son. He doesn't just sort of send a message out and saying, hey, look, get over this, come in. Instead, he goes out and appeals to his older son. The older son is angry and he tries to justify it for every reason. But the most important reason he's justifying his anger is over this. And that is that I've done everything you've asked of me. I've done everything that was expected of me. I just spent the day laboring in the fields. I've done that without question for you. I have done that over and over and over again. I have done everything that could have been hoped for. Oh, and by the way, you've never, ever thrown a party for me. Never. And I love what the father says here because it's so beautiful. My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. I want you to be able to catch this. You see, the issue was not that the father never threw a party for the older brother. The issue is this. The older brother never fully appreciated the heart of the father. And he never fully appreciated something, that dad loved the party. Dad loved a reason to celebrate. Dad loved a reason to be able to say, let's rejoice. Let's be filled with joy here. Let's enjoy the pleasure and the wonder and the beauty of the relationship we have. Let's enjoy what we're able to experience together. The older son never knew that. His life is built strictly around the issue of obedience. And obedience, in his mind, then brings its reward. But the problem was, he missed the blessing. He missed the blessing. And the father wanted him to be able to appreciate something. You've missed the blessing because you've missed my heart. You missed the extravagance of my grace. You missed the extravagance of my love for you. I think we need to be able to stop and ask ourselves and look at it this way too for each one of us. And that is this. How many of us do what we do in our Christian journey out of duty rather than out of relationship? How many of us have so much freedom in our relationship with God that the truth is we're not ruled by disciplines. We're ruled by the fact that we are loved. And we're ruled by the fact that grace is so unbelievably extravagant. It reaches out even to the younger brother. The truth is here is that the prodigal in this, which means somebody who's acting out of character and out of context for what is expected of them, the prodigal here is not the younger brother. Children are rebellious. That is often the way it is. The prodigal here is the father, because the father is acting out of context. The father is showing grace where grace is not deserved. The father is showing love where love should not be expected. The father is not only showing these things, but doing it extravagantly. And then I love what the father says next. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead. I know he wished that I was dead. But the truth is, it was him that was dying. It was him that ended up without anything, feeling lonely, feeling hungry, feeling abandoned, because that is the consequence of sin. But this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. When you and I can appreciate that and the depth of it and the depth of love behind it, then you and I will appreciate the two commands that Jesus gave us. Love God with everything that you are. As a matter of fact, the Apostle John then writes in 1 John where he says, we love because he first loved us. And the more we get lost in the love that he has for us, the greater our responsive love to the Father. But then comes our ability then to be able to fulfill the second command and love your neighbor as yourself. Because when you and I can truly appreciate the extravagant love that God, the Abba Father, has for us because of Jesus, then you and I can love with abandon everybody around us. And by the way, that love is what will tug on the heart and bring people back to the heart of a Father who is good. Thank you so much for your time. Blessings.